I used to believe enemies only lived on the battlefield. Out there, at least, you could see them coming. They wore uniforms, carried weapons, and followed rules of engagement. But the kind of war that starts inside a family has no warning shots, and the wounds it leaves run far deeper. That Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed just after dawn. I still remember the sound of it against the kitchen counter, the way the coffee in my mug trembled when I read the message. "The house is gone, Ellie. It's sold." The words were from Ethan, my half-brother. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since our father's funeral. The house he was talking about wasn't just a property. It was the first thing my father built after leaving the Air Force, a modest craftsman home in Virginia he called the house that honor built. He used his VA loan to buy it, brick by brick, board by board, believing every soldier deserved a place to start over. I promised him I would keep it safe. I promised him I would protect what he worked for. Now it was gone, sold without my signature, without my consent, without even a phone call. At that moment, I realized war doesn't always end when the uniform comes off. Sometimes it follows you home and hides behind a familiar voice. If you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted or lost something that carried the heartbeat of your family, stay with me until the end. Because this story will remind you that revenge isn't about tearing someone down. It's about rebuilding what they tried to take. And if you believe honor still matters, like and subscribe. Together, we keep these stories alive. The drive from Arlington to Norfolk felt longer than it used to. I'd made that trip 100 times over the years, always chasing some memory I thought I'd left behind. This time, the silence inside the car was heavier. Even the radio seemed afraid to interrupt it. My hands stayed at 10 and 2, rigid as if I were still flying a C-130 over hostile skies. Except this wasn't a mission. This was personal. The message from Ethan replayed in my mind like static I couldn't turn off. The house is gone. It's sold. 4 words that tore open something I didn't know was still bleeding. He hadn't called me, hadn't even written a full sentence of explanation. Just that one text, casual and cruel in its brevity. I pulled off the highway near the first rest stop I could find. The morning light caught the side mirror, flashing across my eyes, and I had to blink hard to stop the sting. It wasn't the sun, it was anger, or maybe grief. Sometimes they wear the same face. Ethan and I had never been close. Different mothers, different childhoods, and a lifetime of unspoken resentment between us. After Dad died, he handled the estate because I was deployed in Afghanistan. I trusted him back then. I wanted to. Maybe I still carried the guilt of missing Dad's last breath. Maybe I thought letting Ethan take care of things was a way to make it right. But Ethan had always been restless, chasing shortcuts to success that never quite worked. He was the kind of man who could charm anyone in a bar and then forget to pay the tab. And now, somehow, he had sold the only thing our father left behind that mattered. When I finally reached the old neighborhood, I parked across the street and just sat there, watching the house through the windshield. My breath fogged the glass. The sold sign was planted deep into the front yard. Bright red letters shouting what Ethan hadn't bothered to say himself. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The white porch rails were chipped, the flagpole bent slightly to one side, but I could still see my father's handprints everywhere. The mailbox he fixed with duct tape after a storm. The tiny notch on the doorframe where he measured my height each birthday. The old magnolia tree he said he'd plant again when he retired for good. I stepped out and felt the ground under my boots. My boots, I still wore the same pair I used to wear on base. Habit, maybe, or armor. The neighbors watched from behind curtains. In small towns like this, news travels faster than any official letter. I walked up the porch steps and reached for the doorknob out of reflex. It was locked. My key didn't fit anymore. There's a moment when betrayal stops being an idea and becomes a feeling in your body. For me, it was the cold metal of that useless key, the one thing I thought would always open this door. I sat down on the porch steps, elbows on my knees, and for a while I just breathed. Car drove past, a dog barked somewhere down the block, and life went on as if the world hadn't just tilted off its axis. I pulled out my phone and called Ethan. He picked up on the third ring, his voice too casual, too light. "Hey, Ellie, glad you made it back. You sold Dad's house." There was a pause, then a sigh that sounded rehearsed. Look, it wasn't an easy call, but the IRS was breathing down my neck. The taxes hadn't been paid in years if I hadn't sold it. They would have seized it. I did what I had to do. That's not true. I checked the records. There's no lay-in, no seizure notice. He hesitated, then his tone sharpened, defensive. You wouldn't understand. You've been gone. You don't know how bad things got. Gone. That word hit harder than I expected. Gone like I'd walked away and never looked back. Gone like serving my country was abandonment. I said quietly, Ethan, I trusted you. And I told you I didn't have a choice. You think Dad would want his house auctioned off by the feds? I kept it in the family. You kept it for yourself, I said. The line went silent. Then he muttered, don't make this harder than it already is, Ellie, and hung up. The sound of that call ending was louder than any explosion I'd ever heard. I sat there for a long time. The breeze carried the smell of cut grass and the distant hum of lawnmowers. Everyday life, so ordinary it felt cruel. My father used to say every soldier deserves a home to come back to. He built this house with his hands, painted every room himself, even the baseboards. When he retired, he told me he didn't want a monument. He wanted a porch where his daughter could always come home. That promise now lay beneath a red-soled sign. By evening, the sun dipped low and painted the windows gold. I stood, brushing off the dust from my jeans. The air felt heavier, thicker. Like the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't cry. I never do it in public, but something deep inside me hardened. I had learned in the Air Force that emotion without action is wasted fuel, so I decided to act. The next morning, I went to the county courthouse to check the property transfer. The clerk, a woman with kind eyes and coffee breath, scrolled through her computer and frowned. The sale went through Bright Path Holdings last month, signed off by your brother under power of attorney. That's impossible, I said. That power expired years ago. She shrugged, tired of being the messenger. You might want to check with a lawyer. On my way out, I looked back at the seal on the wall, the words of the Commonwealth of Virginia carved in stone. Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. My father loved that phrase. Standing there, I realized tyranny doesn't always come wearing a crown. Sometimes it wears your last name. The parking lot shimmered with heat. I gripped the steering wheel and whispered the same phrase he taught me before every deployment. Eyes forward, Ward. You can't win a fight looking back, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for the kind of battle waiting for me now. Still, some part of me knew I wouldn't walk away this time. Not again, because when someone tries to erase your family's story, you don't just rebuild the house. You reclaim the truth behind it. Keep listening. This was only the beginning. I started the morning with a pot of black coffee and an empty kitchen table covered in old paperwork. My father had been meticulous about record keeping, a habit born from decades in uniform. Everything he ever owned had a folder: mortgage, insurance, taxes, even the warranty for the refrigerator he bought in 1994. As I sorted through the stack, the scent of dust and coffee mingled, sharp and familiar. I found the original deed. The VA loan paperwork and the last tax statement paid in full. No overdue notices, no pending liens. Ethan's story was unraveling fast. There was one document that caught my eye, a letter Dad had written me during my first deployment. The paper had yellowed, the ink faded at the edges. I unfolded it carefully. He wrote, "Honor isn't about medals or salutes. It's what you do when no one's watching. One day this house will be yours to protect. Keep it standing, not for me, but for what it represents." I traced his handwriting with my thumb, feeling the weight of the promise all over again. By afternoon, I drove to the Bright Path Holdings office downtown. The building was sleek glass and chrome, the kind of place that smelled like ambition and disinfectant. A young receptionist looked up, startled when I said the name Ward. "I'm here about a property you recently purchased on Magnolia Drive," she stammered. "One moment, please," then disappeared through a door. A man in a gray suit appeared, smiling too wide. "MS. Ward, I presume. I'm Mr. Blake, Acquisitions Director. How can I help you? You bought my father's house. I need to see the paperwork." He tilted his head. "Our transactions are public record. I'm afraid I can't disclose internal documentation without legal representation." I leaned forward. "You purchased it under false authorization." "My brother had no legal right to sell." He didn't flinch. "If that's true, MS. Ward, then I'm sure the courts will sort it out, but I assure you we followed procedure." His voice was smooth, too smooth, the kind that hides behind clauses and fine print. When I turned to leave, he added, almost ashamed, "Really? Lovely house. We plan to renovate and flip it. Should fetch a fine price in this market." That word, flip, made my jaw tighten. To him, it was just a profit margin. To me, it was the ground my father bled for. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk for a while, watching people rush past with their coffee cups and briefcases. I wondered how many of them had ever fought for something they couldn't replace. That night, I stayed in a small motel near the interstate. The air smelled of bleach and nostalgia. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. Every sound in that room echoed: the click of the clock, the hum of the fridge, the whisper of traffic outside. My thoughts drifted to my deployments, the times I'd stared at satellite maps tracking enemies I couldn't see. The patience it took to wait for the right moment to act. This was no different, I told myself, just another mission. A domestic one. In the quiet, I imagined my father's voice again. He used to say the hardest fights aren't the ones we train for. They're the ones that find us when we think we're done fighting. He was right. At dawn, I returned to the house. The dew still clung to the grass, and the air held that soft, gray light that only happens before sunrise. I stood there and whispered, "I'm not done yet, Dad." The next day, I met an old friend of my father's, Mr. Caldwell, a retired JAG officer who still practiced law part-time. His office was small, cluttered with case files and faded photos of men in uniform. He looked up when I entered, eyes narrowing with recognition. "You must be Elena Ward. I served with your father back in Kuwait. Sit down, Captain. Old habits die hard." I smiled faintly and corrected him. "Retired, sir. Once a soldier, always a soldier," he said and leaned back. "So what brings you to me?" I told him everything. The text, the sale, the expired power of attorney. He listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You have a case. If the power expires before the sale, the transaction is voidable, but proving intent to defraud will take evidence. You'll need documentation and witnesses." "I have both," I said. He studied me for a moment. "You remind me of your father. He never gave up either." That made me smile, even if it hurt a little. Before I left, he said something that stayed with me. "Justice is a lot like flight. Takes skill to take off, courage to stay in the air, and patience to land it right." As I walked out, the late afternoon sun spilled across the street, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to purpose. This wasn't about revenge. It was about keeping a promise, and maybe, just maybe, about finding my way home again. I didn't know it then, but that quiet determination was about to set off a chain of events that would test everything I'd ever believed about loyalty, family, and what it truly means to serve. Because sometimes the hardest mission isn't overseas. It's the one waiting for you when you come home, and I was ready to begin mine. By the time I walked into the county records office, the air outside had turned heavy with summer heat. It clung to my skin like the memory of a bad dream. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above rows of dusty file cabinets. Everything smelled of paper, toner, and quiet frustration. The kind of place where people came to confirm what they'd already lost. The clerk behind the counter, a man in his 60s wearing a cardigan despite the warmth, looked up from his screen when I gave him my name. "Ward," I said, "property at 414 Magnolia Drive." He typed for a moment, the click of his keyboard echoing like raindrops in a cave. Then he frowned. His glasses slid down his nose. "Looks like it was sold last month." He squinted at the screen, "signed off under power of attorney." My pulse kicked. Power of attorney, that can't be right. He turned the monitor slightly toward me. "See, Ethan Ward. Acting on your behalf." I felt my stomach drop. That document was from 5 years ago when I was deployed overseas. It was temporary, meant only for paying bills and handling small maintenance issues while I was gone. It expired the moment I came back stateside. "Can I see the signature?" I asked. He hesitated. "Public record, ma'am," he said finally, and printed a copy. I took the paper, hands shaking just enough that I folded it twice before looking. The signature at the bottom looked like mine at a glance. The same looping E, the same strong downstroke on the W. But I knew my own handwriting the way a pilot knows the sound of her own engine. This wasn't mine. Outside, I sat in the car with the air conditioning blasting and stared at the document. A fake signature, a false claim of authority, and a company eager to flip a veteran's home for profit. It wasn't just betrayal now, it was a fraud. I thought about calling Ethan, but my anger wasn't ready for his voice. I needed something solid before facing him. Evidence, strategy, the same way we prepared for recon missions. Never confront until you know the terrain. That afternoon, I drove back to Caldwell's office. His law firm sat on the corner of Main and Duke, a converted brick building that looked like it had been standing since the Civil War. Inside, the air was cool, and the faint smell of old books and coffee lingered. He looked up from behind his desk and smiled when he saw me. "You came prepared," he said. "I can see it in your face." I dropped the forged document on his desk. He picked it up, studied it, and let out a slow whistle. "That's a problem. It's fake," I said. "The signature isn't mine." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "Maybe, but proving that will take more than your word. The burden of proof falls on you, Ms. Ward." I crossed my arms. "You served with my father. You know he'd never stand for this." He nodded. "I do, but your father also taught me the law doesn't bend for outrage, no matter how righteous." He tapped the document. "You can't void a sale executed under power of attorney unless you prove it was expired or fraudulent. We'll need to dig." I exhaled, forcing patience. I'd faced bureaucratic red tape in uniform, but this was personal. Every piece of paper here carried the weight of my father's name. Caldwell pulled a legal pad toward him. "I'll contact the registry and confirm the notary if the signature was verified improperly. That's our first crack. In the meantime, you might want to talk to your brother, see what he'll admit." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to march straight to Ethan's apartment and demand answers. Another part of me knew anger rarely won wars. It burned hot and fast, but left you empty afterward. Instead, I asked, "What happens if he already spent the money?" Caldwell's voice softened. "Then we'll deal with that too, but one battle at a time." Driving home. The late sunlight filtered through the trees in gold and gray streaks. I thought of my father again. He used to keep a folder labeled "Important Things" on the top shelf of his desk. Inside were pictures of me in uniform, copies of his discharge papers, and one line written on the back of a grocery receipt: "If anything ever happens to me, protect the house." It's not about money, it's about memory. That night I found the folder just where he'd left it. I opened it carefully. The paper crackling with age. There were bank statements, letters from his service buddies, and a checklist of maintenance tasks. But tucked behind an old envelope was something new, a copy of the VA loan terms signed and notarized years ago. Clear evidence that no taxes were owed, no debts, the property was clean. That was when I realized Ethan hadn't just acted carelessly. He'd planned this. The thought made my chest tighten. My little brother. The kid who used to follow Dad around the yard, mimicking every move. What happened to him? I stared at the ceiling until dawn. The world outside slowly brightened, but I couldn't shake the darkness settling inside me. When I finally picked up the phone, I wasn't calling as a sister. I was calling as a soldier preparing for interrogation. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Ellie, we need to talk," I said. "Now's not a good time." "It wasn't a request, Ethan. Where are you?" Silence. Then with a sigh, he said, "Mom's old place." When I pulled into the driveway half an hour later, he was waiting on the porch. His expression wasn't guilt, it was defiance. The kind you see in someone who's been caught but refuses to admit it. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "You sold Dad's house, Ethan. You forged my signature." He ran a hand through his hair, eyes darting away. "It's not what you think. Then explain it to me." He hesitated, then muttered, "I had debts, Ellie, real ones, and the house was sitting there empty. I figured it was better to sell it than let the bank take it." The bank wasn't taking anything. There were no liens, no taxes owed. "You lied." His jaw clenched. "You don't get it. You were always his favorite, the golden child. I spent my life trying to be enough for him, and he never even saw me." I felt something inside me crack. This wasn't just greed. It was years of buried resentment finally surfacing. "Ethan," I said softly, "he loved you." He laughed bitterly. "Yeah, then why did he leave everything to you?" "Because he trusted me to take care of it," I said. "And you?" He looked away again, his voice breaking. "I just wanted my share." My father's words echoed in my head. Every soldier deserves a home to come back to, but Ethan hadn't wanted a home. He wanted validation, and when he didn't get it, he took the one thing he could. "You didn't just sell a house," I told him. "You sold Dad's honor." For the first time. His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, standing barefoot in the yard with scraped knees and too much pride. Then he turned away, muttering, "Maybe honor doesn't pay the bills." I left before the tears came. Outside, the air smelled of pine and regret. Somewhere, a lawn mower buzzed to life, and I realized life had a cruel way of continuing even when your world stopped. Back in my car, I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked older, harder, but behind them was something else. Resolve, the kind that had carried me through sandstorms and sleepless nights. If this was a war, then it was time to fight it my way, and I wasn't planning to lose. The following week unfolded in slow motion. Every hour felt like another page in a manual I hadn't wanted to read. Caldwell called often, his voice steady, anchoring me to a process that felt both endless and necessary. We confirmed the power of attorney had expired 3 years prior. The notary's stamp on the sale document didn't match state records, and the witness signature, non-existent. Caldwell looked at me across his desk. This isn't just sloppy paperwork. It's intentional. That word intentionally hit harder than I expected. In the military, intent defined everything. The difference between a mistake and a crime, between chaos and command. We'll file a motion to freeze the transaction, he said, but you should prepare yourself. These corporate investors have deep pockets and slick lawyers. I smiled faintly. I've gone up against worse. That night, I sat in the motel again, my laptop open to news articles about Bright Path Holdings. The company specialized in distressed properties, often targeting veterans who'd fallen behind on taxes or maintenance. They'd been sued twice before for coercion and document tampering, both cases quietly settled. It wasn't just my house they were after. It was a pattern. Somewhere between anger and exhaustion, I realized this wasn't only about my father anymore. It was about every veteran who came home to find the system rigged against them. The next morning, I stopped by the house one more time. A construction crew had already started removing the shutters. A blue dumpster sat in the driveway, half full of torn-out carpet and splintered wood. I walked up to one of the workers and asked for the site manager. A man in a hard hat turned, frowning. "Can I help you?" "Yes, you can stop tearing down my father's house." He blinked. "Ma'am, we have orders." I showed him my ID, the Air Force emblem still etched on the card. "Orders can change," I said quietly. He nodded slowly, uneasy, and made a call. Minutes later, the site went still. As I stood there, a memory surfaced. Dad and I repainting the porch one summer, country music playing from the radio, his voice steady as he said, "A house is only as strong as the people who fight for it." Well, Dad, I thought, I'm fighting. By the time I met Caldwell again, he had new information. Ethan received a $10,000 advance payment from Bright Path before the sale closed. The money was transferred to an account under his name. I stared at the statement. He took the money before it was even legal. Caldwell nodded grimly. "It strengthens our case, but it also means your brother could face charges. Are you prepared for that?" Prepared? No. Resigned? Maybe. Later that night, I called Ethan again. His voice was quiet this time, the arrogance gone. "Ellie, I messed up. That's putting it lightly." "I didn't know they'd come after you," he said. "I thought it would be easy. Sign some papers, get the money, pay off the debts. Nobody gets hurt." "But someone always does," I said. He exhaled shakily. "What are you going to do?" "What I was trained to do, find the truth." He said nothing for a while, then whispered, "You sound just like him." I hung up before the tears could betray me again. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. I spent the time gathering documents, witness statements, and every scrap of evidence we could find. Each page felt like another step toward justice, but also another layer of heartbreak. One night, while sorting through my father's files, I found a small USB drive tucked inside an envelope labeled personal. I plugged it into my laptop, and his voice filled the room. "If you're hearing this, Ellie, it means I didn't make it back home. Don't let them take what we built. The house isn't about walls or windows. It's about keeping your promise." I sat there in the dark, tears sliding down my cheeks, listening to the steadiness of his voice. That night, I made a new promise. I wouldn't let his name fade into some court record. The next morning, I delivered the recording to Caldwell. He listened quietly, then said this could change everything. When I left his office, I looked up at the sky, streaked with clouds and light. It reminded me of flying, how the horizon always seemed endless until you broke through the turbulence. And that's what this felt like now. Turbulence before clarity. As I drove past Magnolia Drive again, I whispered, "Not yet, Dad, but I'm getting there." The war had changed. It wasn't fought with weapons anymore. It was fought with paper, signatures, and resolve. But the mission was the same: protect what matters. And no matter how long it took, I was going to win this one, because this time the battlefield was home. The morning I named the plan Operation Homefront, I almost laughed at myself. It sounded like something straight out of a deployment briefing. A title too formal for a woman sitting alone in a motel room surrounded by folders and coffee cups. But I needed that structure, the discipline that had once guided my life. When the world starts spinning, a soldier gives it a mission name. It makes chaos feel containable. Caldwell called around 9. He had that quiet tone he used when bad news came with a silver lining. Bright Path Holdings, he said, was under state investigation for predatory purchasing. They had a pattern of targeting veterans and the elderly, coercing them into sales, then flipping properties through shell companies. He paused before adding, "But this will take time. We'll need to prove your sale was part of that pattern." Time was something Bright Path was counting on. The longer they dragged this out, the faster they could erase everything my father built. That afternoon, I drove to Norfolk's courthouse again to review the public case files. Years of habit came rushing back as I scanned through data, patterns, names. Military training had taught me how to see connections invisible to others. You learn to read landscapes, track patterns, find the weak spot in any defense. Turns out, legal warfare wasn't all that different from tactical recon. The pattern was clear: half a dozen sales executed under questionable authority, all within the last year, all through Bright Path. Veterans' homes, widows' houses. Every file told the same quiet tragedy dressed up as paperwork. I called Caldwell from the parking lot. "They've done this before," I said. "Same notary, same clause buried in the contract." He exhaled. "Then we have leverage." I looked out across the street, watching the sun flare against glass windows. A wave of heat shimmered off the pavement. Somewhere deep down, something steadied inside me. Later that evening, I met Caldwell at his office. He'd spread the files across the table like a war map, red tabs, yellow notes, circles connecting names. "We can file a motion in federal court," he said. "Fraud, forgery, and coercion. It'll freeze Bright Path's assets tied to your sale, but we'll need testimony. Mine, obviously." He nodded, "and Ethan's." My stomach twisted. "He's not exactly eager to cooperate." "You said you didn't want to destroy him," Caldwell reminded gently. "But if we don't include him, Bright Path will use him as a shield." "He's the key." I leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow and steady. For the first time in weeks, I wanted to quit, not because I was afraid of Bright Path, but because this fight was starting to feel like choosing between justice and blood. That night, I sat in my car outside Ethan's apartment. The light in his window flickered as if debating whether to stay on. I almost left. But then I remembered the last words my father said to me before his final surgery. "Take care of your brother. He's got more good in him than he knows." I climbed the stairs and knocked. He opened the door halfway, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Ellie, we need to talk," I said. He hesitated, then stepped aside. The apartment smelled of cheap beer and takeout boxes. On the table sat a half-empty bottle and a stack of unopened mail. "You've been busy," I said quietly. Nodding toward the papers, he rubbed his face. "Look, if you come to yell again, save it." "I didn't come to yell. I came to give you a choice. Help me make this right." He laughed without humor. "Make it right? It's already done. You took 10,000 before the sale even cleared. That's fraud, Ethan. You could go to prison." His face was drained of color. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm not stupid." He looked down at his hands, shaking slightly. "I was desperate, Ellie. You don't know what it's like owing money to people who don't take no for an answer." "I do know what desperation looks like," I said softly. "I've seen it on faces younger than yours, half a world away. But you don't fix your pain by burning down the only home you've got left." He didn't reply. For a long moment, we just stood there, two people tied together by blood and ruin. Finally, I said, "Caldwell's preparing a case. You can cooperate and protect what's left of your future, or you can let Bright Path throw you under the bus." He looked at me then, really looked, and said, "Do you ever stop being a soldier?" "No," I said, "and that's why I'm still standing." As I turned to leave, he whispered, "You sound like him." I paused at the door. Maybe that was the first honest thing he'd said in years. Driving back to the motel, the night felt heavy but less hopeless. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes when you stop expecting apologies and start building strategy. When I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face again, sunburned from yard work, smiling as he handed me a hammer. "One nail at a time, Ellie. That's how you build something that lasts." Maybe that was the key, one piece at a time. The next day, Caldwell and I met with a local reporter who covered housing fraud. She was sharp, quick-talking, the kind of person who could smell a headline before it was written. When she heard Bright Path's name, she leaned forward, eyes bright. "They've been untouchable for years," she said. "If you've got proof, this could blow wide open." "We're not after fame," I said. "We're after fairness." She smiled. "Sometimes the two meet halfway." When I left the office, I caught my reflection in the glass door. The woman staring back at me didn't look like the officer I used to be. She looked stronger, stripped down to essentials. Something was shifting. The mission was no longer about revenge, it was about restoration. Still, I couldn't shake the ache in my chest every time I thought of Ethan. Beneath the anger, I wanted him to remember who we were before all this. Two kids who used to race bikes down the driveway while Dad shouted warnings about the mailbox. But maybe that version of us was gone for good. As the sky turned the color of rust and memory, I whispered into the silence, "I'll bring it back, Dad, no matter what it takes, because some wars are worth fighting even when they break your heart, and this one was mine." The courthouse smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and nerves. I'd been in combat zones quieter than this. Every voice echoed, every shuffle of paper sounded like thunder. Caldwell stood beside me, his briefcase clasped tight. We were here to file the injunction that would temporarily halt Bright Paths renovations until the court reviewed our evidence. It felt strange calling it evidence. For me, it was proof of a promise. After the paperwork was filed, Caldwell leaned toward me. "We'll get a preliminary hearing within 10 days. In the meantime, keep digging. Anything personal from your father might help establish intent." I nodded. Personal. The word felt heavier than it should. That night, I drove back to the house. The construction crew was gone, leaving the place eerily quiet. The porch light still worked, casting a weak glow over the chipped paint and cracked steps. Inside, the air was stale. The floorboards creaked under my boots. I walked from room to room, tracing the outlines of furniture that wasn't there anymore. In the living room, the family photos were gone, but the nails that held them remained, tiny scars on the wall. I touched one, remembering the photo that used to hang there. Dad in uniform, Ethan as a boy, me in my first flight suit. We were smiling, all of us. I couldn't remember the last time that kind of joy had felt real. I went upstairs to Dad's old study. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee. The desk was still there, scarred and scratched but solid. I opened the drawers one by one, searching for something, anything that might help. In the bottom drawer, tucked behind a stack of yellowed receipts, I found a picture frame face down. I turned it over and saw our family photo again, the one missing from downstairs. The back of the frame was slightly loose. When I pried it open, a small USB drive fell into my palm. For a second, I just stared at it, heart pounding. My father wasn't the kind of man who hid things unless they mattered. I drove straight to Caldwell's office, not caring that it was past midnight. The cleaning crew was startled when I walked in. Caldwell appeared a few minutes later, hair tousled, tie gone. "You found something," he said, reading my expression. I plugged the drive into his laptop. A moment later, my father's voice filled the room. "If you're hearing this, Ellie, it means I didn't make it back home. Don't let them take what we built. The house isn't about walls or windows. It's about keeping your promise." The recording was short, but the silence that followed it felt infinite. Caldwell closed the laptop gently. "This changes everything," he said. "It establishes ownership, intent, and moral trust. Under federal property law, it strengthens your claim." I couldn't speak. Hearing his voice after all this time had cracked something open inside me. Grief and relief tangled together in my chest. When I finally found my voice, it came out quiet. "I guess he was still protecting us, even from the grave." Caldwell nodded. He always did. Over the next few days, we gathered the final pieces. The expired power of attorney, the fraudulent payment trail, the audio message confirming the property's intended inheritance. Piece by piece, it all came together. One morning, Caldwell called with a tone that made me sit up straighter. "The federal clerk just confirmed it," he said. "The power of attorney was legally invalid before the sale date. The transaction is voidable under federal statute." For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. That evening, I drove back to the house one last time. The sky was clear and the air smelled faintly of salt from the bay. I sat on the porch steps, plugged in my earbuds, and played the recording again. "If you're hearing this, Ellie, remember, this house isn't about walls. It's about keeping promises." His voice carried across the empty yard, soft but steady. The street was quiet except for crickets and the distant hum of cars. A light breeze rustled the trees, and for a brief, fleeting second, I could almost believe he was sitting beside me again. I looked at the old magnolia tree, the one he planted when I was 10, and whispered, "I kept the promise, Dad. I didn't let them take it." And though no one answered, the wind shifted, warm and familiar, like approval. The battle wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned. Sometimes winning doesn't come with applause or headlines. It comes in quiet moments like this, when you stand on the ground your family once built and know it's still yours. I rose to my feet, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and turned back toward the fading light. Operation Homefront was more than a mission now, it was a vow, and I intended to see it through, no matter how long it took. Because when you fight for something built on love, the victory isn't in taking back what was stolen. It's in remembering why it mattered in the first place. The morning of the hearing began before the sun. I woke in the half-dark, the motel curtains drawn tight, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and nerves. It felt like the calm before a storm, that breathless stillness soldiers know before engines roar and orders come through. Except this time, the battlefield wasn't a desert or a sky, it was a courtroom. I put on my uniform blazer, not military, but navy blue, pressed and simple. A piece of armor nonetheless. My reflection in the mirror looked older than I remembered. There were new lines near my eyes, but my gaze held steady. For the first time in months, I felt my father's presence on my shoulder. Caldwell picked me up at 7. He drove in silence most of the way, his briefcase sitting like a third passenger between us. As we neared the courthouse, he finally said, "You don't need to win every argument, you just need to tell the truth." I smiled faintly. That's what Dad used to say before every inspection. The courthouse loomed ahead, pale stone catching the morning light. Reporters waited on the steps, their cameras glinting like watchful eyes. The story had spread faster than I expected, a veteran fighting a real estate giant, betrayed by her own brother. It had all the makings of a small-town legend, but to me it wasn't a headline, it was home. Inside, the hearing room buzzed with quiet tension. The Bright Path lawyers sat in tailored suits, polished and calm. Their lead counsel, a man named Mr. Rourke, nodded curtly when I entered, his smile all teeth and calculation. Ethan sat beside them, shoulders hunched, face pale. He wouldn't meet my eyes. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The sound of chairs scraping against tile echoed through the room like the first drumbeat of battle. The proceedings began formally, introductions, motions. A flood of legal phrases that blurred into white noise, but when Caldwell stood to present our case, the room shifted. His voice was calm, deliberate, each word placed with precision. "Your Honor," he began, "this case isn't about money, it's about integrity. My client, Ms. Elena Ward, is a retired Air Force officer. Her late father, Colonel James Ward, purchased the home in question with a VA loan, a program built on trust between this nation and its service members. That trust was violated when Bright Path Holdings acquired the property under a fraudulent authorization." He handed the judge the folder we'd built piece by piece, the expired power of attorney, the falsified signature, the audio file of my father's voice. Rourke stood smoothly. "Objection, Your Honor. The recording is inadmissible." The judge, a gray-haired woman with clear, kind eyes, leaned forward. "On what grounds?" Rourke hesitated. "Relevance." "Overruled," she said. "Let's hear it." When the recording played, my father's voice filled the courtroom. The words were simple. "If you're hearing this, Ellie, it means I didn't make it back home. Don't let them take what we built. The house isn't about walls or windows. It's about keeping your promise." For a moment, the room went still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. I caught a flicker of movement, Ethan's hand tightening on the table. Rourke recovered first, adjusting his cufflinks. "Your Honor, the sale was executed under a valid power of attorney. Any clerical error was unintentional." Caldwell stepped forward. "Respectfully, Your Honor, this wasn't clerical. The power of attorney expired 3 years before the sale. The notary's seal doesn't match the state registry, and evidence shows Bright Path made an advance payment to Mr. Ward prior to closing in violation of contract law." The judge turned her gaze to Ethan. "Mr. Ward, did you receive funds before the sale was finalized?" Ethan hesitated. His lips moved, but no sound came. Finally, he nodded. "Yes." Rourke stiffened. "Ethan, I advise." The judge held up her hand. "That's enough." Caldwell continued. "My client has made it clear she isn't seeking damages. She's seeking restoration of property ownership and accountability for misconduct." The judge looked at me. "Ms. Ward, do you wish to make a statement?" My throat tightened, but I stood. Every eye in the room followed as I walked to the center. "Your Honor, I don't want to punish anyone, not my brother. Not even the people who tricked him. I just want to keep a promise to my father. He served this country his whole life. He believed a soldier's home was sacred. It's where we heal, where we remember who we are. That's what this house was to him and to me. For a moment, my voice faltered, but I kept going. He taught me that honor isn't a medal you wear. It's a choice you make when no one's looking. And I can't stand here and let that choice be sold off for profit. The room was silent when I sat down. Caldwell placed a steady hand on my arm. "You did fine," he whispered. Across the aisle, Ethan's head hung low. His lawyer whispered something, but he shook his head slowly. When the judge recessed for deliberation, the tension broke like a sudden storm. Reporters whispered, papers shuffled, cameras clicked. But in that chaos, I felt oddly calm. Caldwell leaned over. "You did exactly what you came to do." I stared at the empty bench where the judge had been. "I'm not sure yet," I said quietly, when the court reconvened. Every sound felt amplified: footsteps, paper rustle, the ticking of the clock above the door. The judge returned, her expression unreadable. "The court finds the power of attorney expired prior to the sale date. The transaction is therefore void under federal law. Ownership of 414 Magnolia Drive is restored to Ms. Elena Ward. Furthermore, Bright Path Holdings is fined for failure to verify authorization and for predatory conduct under the Veteran Protection Act." A wave of murmurs filled the room. My heart hammered once, then steadied. The judge continued. "Mr. Ethan Ward, this court acknowledges your cooperation and confession of financial distress. While your actions were unlawful, your sister's request for leniency is noted." Ethan lifted his eyes at that, confusion flickering through the shame. The judge nodded once, case closed, and just like that it was over. The gavel struck wood, and the sound rang through the room like a final salute. Outside the courthouse, the sky opened wide and blue, the kind of clear that only comes after a storm. People were still talking on the steps, their voices a hum behind me, but all I heard was the echo of the judge's gavel in my chest. Caldwell was beside me, adjusting his glasses, smiling in that quiet way that never demanded attention. He said softly, "You did it." I shook my head. "Not yet. The verdict might have ended the case." But it hadn't ended what was broken between Ethan and me. Winning back the house was one thing. Winning back the family was another kind of battle altogether. Ethan came out a few minutes later, head down, walking like a man whose boots were made of lead. The reporters tried to crowd him, but he kept going until he saw me. For a second, he froze, caught between shame and hope. I waited, letting the silence stretch until he finally walked toward me. "You didn't have to do that," he said, asking the judge for leniency. "I did," I replied, "because someone has to start doing the right thing." He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I'm sorry, Ellie, I don't even know where to start." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photo from the old living room wall, the one of us standing beside Dad, his hands resting on our shoulders, sunlight spilling across the porch. I held it out to him. "If you want to make things right, start here, help me fix the house." He looked at the picture, then at me, then back at the courthouse behind us. A small, shaky breath escaped him. "Okay," he said. That afternoon, we drove together to Magnolia Drive. The house looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of color and life, but beneath the decay there was still something solid, something worth saving. The grass was tall, the shutters half-hanging, the front porch sagging under years of neglect. Yet when the wind passed through the magnolia tree out front, I could still smell summer the way it used to be. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his hands buried in his pockets. He said quietly, "I used to hate this place. Every creak, every smell, it reminded me of what I wasn't." "You were just a kid," I said. "We both were." He looked down, scuffing the dirt with his shoe. "I guess I just never thought Dad actually loved me." I turned to face him. "He did, Ethan. He just didn't always know how to show it, but he believed in you even when you didn't believe in yourself." He swallowed hard, eyes glassy. "Maybe it's too late for that now." "It's not too late for anything," I said. "That's why we're here." I handed him a hammer from the toolbox in my trunk. He stared at it for a moment, then smiled weakly. "I don't even know where to start." I pointed to the porch rail, half-rotted and peeling. "Start there, one nail at a time." He nodded, and for the first time in years, we worked side by side. The sound of hammering echoed through the quiet street, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat coming back to life. The neighbors peeked out from porches and windows, curious but respectful. A few even waved. It reminded me how communities remember the good ones, how my father had once helped everyone on this block fix their fences or roofs without ever asking for a thing in return. After a while, Ethan broke the silence. "Have you ever thought about re-enlisting?" I smiled faintly every day. Then I remember I already did my time. Now my mission's different. He nodded thoughtfully. Guess we both have new missions now. We kept working until the light started to fade. Sweat rolled down my back, dust settled on my arms, and yet I felt lighter than I had in years. There's something about rebuilding that heals the parts of your war never could. When we finally stopped, we sat on the steps, our tools scattered around us. Ethan's hands were blistered, but he looked content. He leaned back against the railing and said, "You think he'd be proud of us?" I followed his gaze to the magnolia tree, its leaves shimmering in the sunset. "Yeah," I said, "I think he already is." The wind carried the scent of cut wood and salt from the bay. The world felt quiet again, almost forgiving. After a long silence, Ethan said, "I keep thinking about the day he died, how I didn't even go to the hospital. I was scared, Ellie. I couldn't face him." "You were 17, I reminded him. "Nobody knows how to face death at that age. Not even soldiers." He looked at me, eyes shining. "You forgave him, didn't you?" I took a deep breath. Forgiveness isn't something you give once. It's something you practice every day until it stops hurting. He nodded, thoughtful. "Guess I've got a lot of practicing to do." We sat there until the sky turned purple. The first stars blinked awake, and for a moment I felt the kind of peace I hadn't known since before Afghanistan, before funerals, before lawyers and betrayal. Later, when Ethan went inside to check the wiring, I stayed on the porch alone. The boards creaked under my feet, and I smiled at the sound. It wasn't a weakness anymore, it was a memory. I took out my phone and scrolled through the pictures, the courtroom, the documents, the house half torn down, and then the one that mattered most, Dad standing with us years ago, holding up a small wooden sign he'd carved himself. It read, "The house that honor built." I remembered the day he made it. He'd said, "One day this will remind you who you are, even when you forget." I whispered to the night, "You were right, Dad." A soft breeze passed, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it was something else, the kind of quiet affirmation only the soul recognizes. When Ethan came back out, he held a flashlight and a small box of old screws. He smiled shyly. "Found these in the pantry. Think they'll still hold?" I grinned. "They held up this house once. I bet they'll hold again." We worked a little longer under the porch light. The sound of metal against wood echoed down the street like a steady drumbeat, like the rhythm of something being set right. When we finally stopped, Ethan sat on the steps and looked up at the sky. "You know, I don't think I've seen stars this clear in years." "That's because you've been looking down too long," I said gently. He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carried both sadness and relief. Maybe, as the night deepened. We didn't talk much, we didn't need to. The silence between us was no longer heavy, it was full of possibilities. When I finally stood to leave, Ethan said, "You'll come back tomorrow, right?" I nodded. "You think I'd let you fix this place alone?" He smiled. "Guess not." As I walked to my car, I looked back one last time. The porch glowed under the light, fresh boards gleaming pale against the old ones. Ethan was still sitting there, hammer beside him, staring out at the magnolia tree. For the first time, he looked at peace. I drove home with the windows down, the cool night air washing over me. For months, I'd been running on anger and duty, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like coming home. I thought about everything we'd lost and everything we'd managed to reclaim, not just a house, but a name, a promise, a sense of belonging. And in that quiet space between breath and memory, I realized something. This wasn't a story about revenge. It never really had been. It was about redemption, about what happens when you stop fighting against the past and start building a future worthy of it. The house would take months to finish. The wounds, maybe years, but both could heal, given enough patience and care. When I reached the motel, I sat for a moment before getting out, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. The moon hung low over the horizon, silver and steady. I whispered into the dark, "Mission complete for today. Tomorrow we will rebuild again, because some battles aren't won in courtrooms or headlines. They're won in quiet places, with calloused hands and open hearts." And as I finally turned off the car and closed my eyes, I felt the simplest truth settle deep inside me. Peace isn't something you find, it's something you make. And after everything, that was the victory worth fighting for. The first morning after the verdict, I woke before sunrise. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I smelled the faint mix of paint and dust, the soft creak of floorboards, and it came back to me. The house, my house, ours again. Outside, dawn was breaking over Magnolia Drive, the sky a wash of pale gold and blue. The magnolia tree glimmered with dew, the yard still damp from last night's rain. Everything looked quiet, raw, and possible. I stood on the porch barefoot, mug of coffee in hand, breathing in the kind of air that only comes after long storms. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. Ethan showed up not long after, carrying a toolbox and 2 cups from the diner down the road. He looked different already. Lighter, still worn around the edges, but steady. He handed me the coffee and grinned. "Thought you'd need reinforcements." I smiled. "You're late." He laughed softly. "I figured if I showed up too early, you'd put me to work before I finished my breakfast." He wasn't wrong. We started where we'd left off, sanding, scraping, repainting. The rhythm of rebuilding was its own kind of therapy. The scent of new paint filled the air, sharp and clean, covering the scars of old layers. Each brushstroke felt like a small redemption, a declaration that we were not our mistakes. As I painted the living room walls, I remembered how they'd looked before, lined with Dad's medals, our family photos, his old Air Force commendations framed with pride but never vanity. He used to tell me that medals weren't proof of valor. They were proof of survival. Ethan caught me staring at the wall. "You think he'd like the color?" I smiled faintly. "I think he'd like that we're doing it together." By mid-morning, sunlight spilled across the floors, glinting off the wet paint. I opened the windows to let the breeze through. The house seemed to sigh, breathing again after years of silence. Later, while we were taking a break on the porch, an old truck pulled into the driveway. For a second, I didn't recognize it. Then the door opened and my mother stepped out. She hadn't been here since Dad's funeral. She looked smaller than I remembered, hair silver now, eyes soft but cautious. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she smiled the same smile she'd given me after my first flight exam, equal parts pride and worry. "You did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You brought it home." I walked down the steps and hugged her. It wasn't one of those polite embraces you give out of duty. It was real. She smelled like lavender and rain. "I didn't do it alone," I said. She looked past me at Ethan, who stood on the porch, hammer still in hand, unsure what to do. For a heartbeat, the past seemed to hover in the space between them. Then she opened her arms. He hesitated, then stepped into her embrace. When she finally let go, she wiped her eyes and looked around. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. "I know," I said. "I can feel him here." We spent the rest of the morning sorting through the last of Dad's things. Old flight logs, letters from his squadron, notes written in his neat block handwriting. He'd kept everything, even the tiny blue ribbon from my first grade spelling bee. Mom laughed when she found it. "He used to carry this in his wallet," she said. Said it reminded him that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. That one hit deep. By the afternoon, Ethan was outside repainting the porch while I scrubbed the old tile in the kitchen. Mom made sandwiches and sweet tea, humming softly to some tune I didn't recognize. It felt like a scene from another lifetime, simple, ordinary human. The kind of peace you don't notice until it's gone. When the mail truck rolled by, I found an envelope addressed to me. It was from a veterans nonprofit I'd reached out to months earlier while researching Bright Path scams. Inside was a note thanking me for bringing attention to the case and a question: would I consider helping lead a local veterans outreach center? I read it twice, then looked up at the window where sunlight hit the table. Something stirred inside me, the kind of clarity that feels like a mission briefing, except this time no one was giving the orders. That evening, I told Ethan and Mom about it over dinner. The idea is called Homefront Haven, I said. It'd be a place where women veterans could find legal help, housing, support, counseling. A place where no one feels forgotten when the uniform comes off. Mom's eyes softened. "Sounds like something your father would have built." Ethan nodded slowly. "You should do it." I looked between them. "I can't do it alone. I'll need someone to handle the financial side, organize grants, manage the books." Ethan smiled for the first time that day, not forced, not awkward. "I can do that." "You sure?" I asked. "It'll mean a lot of responsibility." He shrugged. "Maybe that's exactly what I need." And in that small kitchen, with paint still drying on the walls and sawdust clinging to our shoes, a new mission took shape. Not a battle, not revenge, but rebuilding something bigger than ourselves. Over the next few weeks, the house transformed. The walls gleamed with fresh color. The floors shone after polish. I planted flowers in the front yard, lavender, daisies, a few wild magnolias. Ethan fixed the shutters. Mom stitched new curtains. Every piece of it carried a heartbeat. One morning, while hanging an American flag above the porch, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman staring back wasn't the one who'd come home broken, angry, and guarded. She was someone rebuilding from the inside out. Sometimes healing doesn't come in the grand gestures. It comes in the quiet act of standing your ground, of mending what was once shattered. As the wind caught the flag, it snapped gently in the air, its colors bright against the blue sky. For a moment, I could almost hear Dad's voice again, low and steady. Every soldier deserves a home to come back to, and maybe that's what I was building all along. That night, as we sat on the porch eating takeout under a canopy of stars, Ethan asked, "Do you think it's really over?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "Wars like this don't end," I said quietly. "They just change shape." He nodded, understanding more than I expected. "Then maybe this time we fight for peace." I smiled. "That's the only kind worth fighting for." The cicadas hummed in the trees, the magnolia blossoms swayed in the night air, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. And though I didn't say it out loud, I knew the truth deep down. This house wasn't just a home anymore. It was a promise, a living testament that even after betrayal, after loss, after war, there is always a way back. All you have to do is start rebuilding. The days that followed were filled with paint, laughter, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from building something real. Every nail driven into wood, every wall brushed with fresh color felt like a heartbeat sinking back into rhythm. The house had stopped being a structure. It had become a living thing again, stitched together with effort, forgiveness, and a stubborn kind of love. By late summer, Magnolia Drive was beginning to look like it used to. The grass was trimmed, the porch was strong. The magnolia tree bloomed thick with white petals that caught the morning light. Sometimes, when I'd sit on the steps with my coffee, I'd catch myself smiling for no reason at all. That's how peace sneaks up on you, quietly, patiently, after you've stopped expecting it to return. Ethan had moved into the small room over the garage, just like when we were kids. He worked part-time at a local accounting office while helping me plan the next phase, the center, Homefront Haven. The name came to me while painting the kitchen cabinets. It sounded simple, almost soft, but it carried the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. Homefront Haven would be for women like me, veterans who came home to silence instead of parades, who fought invisible battles long after the uniform came off. A place where they could find resources, talk, heal, and rebuild their own homes, their own lives. I met with the local council, the Veterans Board, and the nonprofit that had first reached out. Every meeting felt like a new mission briefing, except this time the objective wasn't to destroy, it was to be restored. One morning, Mom joined me on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and a small box in her hands. She placed it beside me gently. "I found this in your father's old desk," she said. "Thought you should have it." Inside were photos, my father at his graduation from flight school, him holding me as a baby. A few letters he'd written to Mom during deployment. At the bottom of the box was something else, a small brass plate with engraved words, "Honor lives where love endures." I ran my thumb over the letters, tracing the grooves, feeling the weight of it. I knew exactly where it belonged. That afternoon, I screwed it into the front porch railing, just beneath the flag we'd hung weeks before. The brass caught the sunlight and shimmered softly. For a long time, I stood there, just watching. It wasn't about grief anymore. It was about gratitude. A few days later, Ethan came home carrying a stack of folders. He'd been working quietly behind the scenes, crunching numbers, reaching out to donors, even applying for small community grants. "I think we can actually make this happen," he said, setting the papers down. "You mean the center?" He nodded. "Homefront Haven. We've got enough funding to start small. Maybe use part of the house until we can expand." For a moment, I couldn't speak. After everything we'd been through, seeing him believe again, not just in me, but in himself, was more powerful than any verdict. "You really think we can do it?" I asked. He smiled, the kind of steady smile Dad used to have. "We already are. We spent the next weeks preparing." The dining room became an office space. The old living room turned into a small counseling area with donated furniture and a bookshelf lined with military memoirs, legal guides, and journals. I printed flyers, made calls, posted notices around town. It felt unreal the first time someone walked up the porch steps asking for help. Her name was Carla, a Navy mechanic, recently divorced, couch surfing with 2 kids and a service dog. She sat at the kitchen table, eyes tired, voice small. "I don't need pity," she said, "just direction." I smiled and poured her coffee. "We've got plenty of that." When she left that afternoon with housing contacts, food vouchers, and a quiet kind of hope in her eyes, I knew this place was finally doing what it was meant to do. More women came after that, a single mom who'd served in Iraq, a retired medic struggling with PTSD, a widow from the Air National Guard. They found each other, shared stories, fixed each other's cars, planted flowers out front. The house that once carried pain began to fill with laughter again. One evening, after everyone had gone, I walked through the empty living room. The air was warm, humming with the faint echo of voices and life. I paused by the window and looked out at the flag waving softly in the dusk. Ethan was outside tightening one of the porch rails, his shirt smeared with paint, hair damp with sweat. He looked up and grinned. "You think Dad would charge us rent for all this work?" I laughed. "He'd probably make us mow the neighbors' lawns too." Ethan shook his head, chuckling, then looked up at the flag. "He'd be proud, though. You know that, right?" I nodded. "Yes, I think he finally got what he wanted." Later that night, after the house went quiet, I sat at Dad's old desk and wrote in a notebook I kept since my deployment days. Not a diary exactly, more like a running log of missions, only now the entries were about life instead of war. That day I wrote, "War taught me about loss, but this loss taught me about peace. Maybe they're not opposites after all. Maybe one prepares you to understand the other." I closed the book and turned off the lamp through the window. The porch light glowed on the brass plaque, "Honor lives where love endures." The words no longer felt like something my father left behind. They felt like something he passed on. Weeks turned into months. Homefront Haven grew quietly. Volunteers came from nearby bases, local churches, even the high school rock program. The town that once whispered about our family's scandal now came to paint walls, donate furniture, or drop off homemade pies. Ethan handled every dollar with care, every ledger balanced, every receipt filed. Watching him work, I realized redemption isn't always loud. Sometimes it's found in small acts of reliability. One afternoon, while cleaning the office, I found the old USB drive, the one with Dad's recording. For a moment, I just held it in my hand, unsure if I wanted to hear it again. Then I plugged it into the computer. His voice filled the room, soft and steady as I remembered. "If you're hearing this, Ellie, it means I didn't make it back home. Don't let them take what we built. The house isn't about walls or windows. It's about keeping your promise." I sat back and let the words settle. This time they didn't break me, they rebuilt me. The next morning, we held the official dedication for Homefront Haven. The yard was filled with neighbors, veterans, families, and a few curious reporters. Mom stood beside me, clutching my hand. Ethan adjusted the microphone, nervous as always, then nodded for me to speak. I stepped forward, looked out at the faces before me, and said, "This house was built decades ago by a man who believed every soldier deserves a place to return to. He's not here today, but his promise is, and I think that's what keeps this place alive." There was a pause, that brief, sacred silence before applause. Then the crowd clapped, some wiped their eyes, and for a fleeting second, I felt the weight of every mile, every battle, every loss lift off my shoulders. When the ceremony ended, I stood on the porch, watching the flag ripple in the wind. The sunlight hit it just right, turning the red to gold for a heartbeat. In that light, I felt him again, my father, not as a ghost, but as part of everything that had survived. As the camera pulled back in my mind, as if this were the closing frame of some long, hard film, my voice found its way into the quiet. This house isn't about bricks, it's about keeping promises. And with that truth anchored deep in my heart, the flag waved higher, the magnolia petals drifted across the yard, and for the first time in years, I felt completely home. I didn't rebuild that house to get revenge. I rebuilt it to keep a promise. Because for every soldier, a home is more than wood and walls. It's a place to return to when the noise of the world finally fades. It's where the uniform comes off, but the honor stays. When I first came back, I thought justice meant fighting harder, shouting louder, proving everyone wrong. But justice isn't always found in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it's found in forgiveness, in showing up again, even after the world has counted you out. That house taught me something the battlefield never could. You don't fight to destroy what hurts you. You fight to rebuild what they tried to take. If you've ever lost something you love, don't believe it's gone forever. Sometimes all it takes is one steady voice saying, "I'm not giving up my home or my honor. My name is Elena Ward. I am a veteran, a daughter, a sister, and a believer that peace is not the absence of battle. Courage to rebuild in its aftermath." This is the story of the house that honor built. And it's also a reminder that every veteran carries more than memories of war. We carry the quiet strength to start over. If you believe justice doesn't need armor to exist, if you believe in second chances, then subscribe and share this story. Because somewhere out there, another soldier is still fighting to come home. And maybe, just maybe, your voice helps them find the way back.